Good morning, everyone. We are very happy to welcome you to today's program spotlighting historian Dr. Andrew Porwancher and his recent wonderful book, American Maccabee, Theodore Roosevelt and the Jews. Theodore Roosevelt was an energetic, larger-than-life character who captured Americans' imaginations. He was a rough rider, trust buster, conservationist, and even the inspiration for the beloved toy the teddy bear. Here's, for those of you who didn't see him before, here's Teddy in his Rough Rider outfit. You can tell probably that I double as a children's librarian. What American Maccabee offers readers and historians is a unique perspective on Theodore Roosevelt. Andrew Porwancher looks at Roosevelt through the fascinating lens of his involvement with the Jewish community. And come to find out, many of the issues Roosevelt grappled with over 100 years ago in connection with American Jews are freshly relevant and urgent today, including immigration, diversity, free speech, anti-Semitism, and how the American government reacts to human rights abuses in foreign countries. Andrew will be in conversation with podcast host Michael Zeldin. More about both guests in a moment. This program is sponsored by Addis Israel in Washington, D.C. and Congregation Bethel in Bethesda, Maryland. We're grateful for the longtime support of the Addis Israel Sisterhood, the Women of Bethel, the Library Committee, and Men's Club. We also appreciate the many people who are joining us from other communities in the D.C. area, from around the U.S. and from Canada. You are all very welcome. I'm Robin Jacobson, the librarian at Addis Israel. I also facilitate Bethel's book club together with Marge London, who's here today too. As usual, Marge and I had fun choosing Zoom backgrounds connected to our guest author's book. I'm in Teddy Roosevelt's library in his beloved home, Sagamore Hill. This Long Island residence served as the summer White House during Roosevelt's presidency. When you see Marge, you'll find her also at Sagamore Hill, standing outside the large, rambling, welcoming house. Before we introduce our guests, let me mention the next two online book programs. On Thursday, February 5th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we will host author Michelle Young to talk about her book, The Art Spy. This nonfiction book tells the remarkable story of Rose Valland, a World War II French resistance hero. Despite great danger, Valland secretly tracked and sabotaged German art thefts from Jewish art dealers and others. Why did she risk her life to protect art? Would we? And then on Monday, March 16th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, we will host author Richard Kreitner to talk about his recent nonfiction book, Fear No Pharaoh, American Jews, the Civil War, and the Fight to End Slavery. The registration links for both Art Spy and Fear No program are in the chat. Fear No Pharaoh programs are in the chat. Early registrants never miss a bonus drop. Just saying. And now, Marge will introduce you to today's guests.
It's a pleasure to welcome and introduce Andrew Porwancher, who is joining us today from Tempe, Arizona. A native of Princeton, New Jersey, Andrew earned degrees from Northwestern and Brown before receiving his PhD in history from the University of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. Currently, he serves as a professor of history at Arizona State University. American Maccabee is Andrew's fifth book and the winner of the 2025 Theodore Roosevelt Book Prize for Exceptional Scholarship. His previous books include The Jewish World of Alexander Hamilton, which won the Journal of the American Revolution Book of the Year Award. Another earlier book, The Devil Himself, about a 19th century American duel and murder trial, was adapted for the stage at Dublin's historic Smock Alley Theatre. This morning, Andrew will be in conversation with Michael Zeldin. Michael is a TV and radio legal and political affairs analyst, as well as the host of the podcast That Said with Michael Zeldin, which explores the ideas, events, and people that share our world. Michael has also served as a federal prosecutor, private sector lawyer, law professor, and the principal in a global consulting firm. We look forward to Andrew and Michael's conversation about American Maccabee. At the end of the program, there will be some time for audience questions. To ask a question, please write it in the chat box. You can submit a question at any time during the program, and we will turn to it once we reach the Q&A period. Also, we invite you to purchase American Maccabee from our local bookstore, Politics and Prose. You'll find a discount code in the chat. Welcome, Andrew and Michael. Robin will bring you on.
There's Michael, and let's add Andrew. Welcome to you both. We are so happy and excited to have you both here, and you can start your conversation whenever you're ready.
Hey, Andrew.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm well. I'm well. Thank you so much for having me on your podcast. And thank you so much to Addis Israel and to Robin and Marge and everyone behind the scenes who was involved in bringing today together.
You write in the introduction to this book that writing presidential history is often a fraught exercise, writing about Jewish history even more so, and that the nexus of the two might well be combustible. So, why did you choose this combustible topic, and how did you choose it?
Yeah, thank you. I was in the office of the great Jonathan Sarna, the Dean of American Jewish History at Brandeis University, and I was talking to him about some potential book talks or book topics that I was considering. And we talked about Theodore Roosevelt, and Sarna said, he's really the president for whom there needs to be a book on his relationship with the Jewish community, and no one has touched it yet. And so when Sarna gives you the green light, you go 1,000 miles an hour in that direction. And so I was really grateful for the opportunity to get to tackle this topic and be the first one to do it. I think that the presidency is often combustible because it's an institution through which Americans express our values as a people. It's the one office that is elected by all Americans. And questions of Jewish belonging and Jewish identity are often combustible because they hit a raw nerve. And that's not just true in American society and American history, but that's been true throughout the global history of Jewry from the very beginning. And I talked about this in my Hamilton book. The question of Jewish belonging in America has always been a litmus test, not the only one, but an important one for whether America would fulfill or forsake its founding promise of equality enshrined in the Declaration of Independence. And the presidency's relationship to the Jewish community is one means, an important means by which we assess whether that promise is going fulfilled or not. And so Roosevelt and his relationship with the Jewish community, I think, became a very rich vein to tap in a bid to understand the extent to which the American promise was made real for the Jewish community in the United States.
Yeah. And I have to say, I've read 180 books on this podcast, many dealing with topics that touch on this, but this was like so enlightening. I had no idea. We were teasing before the show when Robin said we're going to do a book on Teddy Roosevelt and the Jews. I thought, well, this is going to be a short story. But it turns out not to be. Yes.
Indeed. And as I had mentioned to you earlier, I told my publisher, oh, this is going to be a short book. And I ended up turning in the book 2 years after the deadline. And thank you very much, Fred, my editor, for being so endlessly patient with me in what turned out to be my longest book, because the content was so rich, and the depth and complexity of Roosevelt's relationship with Jewry could only be dealt with in a book of this size. And so I was grateful to have the time to do it, and grateful that I was undertaking this book after I got tenure, so I wasn't on quite such a loud ticking clock. I had the time to actually bring it to fruition and give the subject what I hope is its full due.
It sure was. So tell us a little bit about, I want to talk a little bit just about the title of the book for a minute. You write that the Jewish tradition that Roosevelt most venerated was the heroism of the Maccabee warriors, and that he held these ancient rebels as the model for American Jewry, and that he saw the Maccabees as a useful antidote to the anti-Semitic trope that male Jews were feckless cowards. So talk about that, please.
For sure. And I think to properly address that question, I have to go back to Roosevelt's childhood. His father tells Theodore when Theodore is young, you have the mind, but you have not the body. You must make your body. Theodore was a very sickly child. He had a particularly crippling form of asthma. He suffered from other various physical ailments. And Roosevelt resolved at this young age to make this great weakness of his physical frailty, one of his great strengths. And his father installs a home gym. Roosevelt ultimately takes to boxing when he's an undergrad at Harvard. And of course, he becomes a cowboy in the Dakota Badlands. He goes on to martial glory in the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt is obsessed with martial valor. He is fixated on this ideal of masculine grit. And so it is only natural, given Roosevelt's orientation, that when he looks to the Jewish tradition, the element of Jewish history that earns his great affection and fascination are those Maccabee warriors, those ancient rebels who challenge Greek rule and are able to establish a Jewish kingdom in Judea. And Roosevelt was always on the lookout for what he called the Maccabee type of Jew. That is the Jew whose vigor and valor was reminiscent of those ancient warriors. And Roosevelt once says to a friend, I wished I had a little Jew in me. And I have to imagine that in making that comment, Roosevelt's conception of the kind of Jewish strain he wished he had in him was that of the American Maccabee.
Mm. This was a very complicated period of time, Roosevelt's political career. You write that his complicated history with Jewry reflected the countervailing forces acting upon him at any given time, and that he ascended to the White House in the throes of a great national transformation that really shaped the world, not just the United States, but the world during this period. So let's talk macro about this period of time, and then let's turn to some of the positions that Roosevelt had that he wanted to act on his faith-based do-good proposition that was instilled in him by his father.
In Roosevelt's era, America was not yet the dominant global superpower that would emerge in the post-World War II era, but America was also not this fledgling young nation on the periphery of global empires that it had once been at the inception of the country in the late 18th century. In Roosevelt's day, America was becoming a serious player in world politics that was beginning to project its power well beyond its shores. And at the same time, more people are flooding into the United States, and they're coming from parts of the world, and particularly from parts of Europe that hadn't traditionally been the source of migration. Much of American immigration had come from Northern and Western Europe for the first century of the American Republic. But in Roosevelt's day, increasingly you saw immigrants from places like Southern and Eastern Europe, including Eastern European Jews. And so, as I say in the book, at that moment, America was coming to the world, and the world was coming to America. And that path to globalization was full of potholes. And so the broader historical context in which Roosevelt is forging a relationship with the Jewish community is taking place amid deep anxieties about America's place on the world stage and also about the internal composition of the American body politic. And Michael, you wanted me to touch on his faith as well, is that right?
Yes, because he had this Christian do good deeds orientation to him, right?
Indeed, Roosevelt grows up in a particular strain of Protestantism known as social gospel Protestantism. And this is a particular variety of Christianity that emphasizes operationalizing your faith through deeds. And it particularly put a premium on extending your hand to the stranger in your midst. In other words, embracing new immigrants, not shunning them. And so there were many members of the Protestant elite in Roosevelt's day who shunned these strange newcomers speaking in alien tongues who were flooding the streets of American cities. But Roosevelt's particular inflection of Christianity was much more hospitable to the likes of the indigent Jews who were fleeing Eastern European oppression and seeking a new redemptive homeland in America.
Yeah, and in fact, to the point that you made, I think from colonial times to the onset of Roosevelt's political career, there were about 1 million Jews in the United States. In his 7.5 years of sort of public life, an additional million plus come. Yes?
Yeah, the Jewish population that had taken a quarter millennia to amass until the eve of Roosevelt's presidency is nearly doubled in just those 2 terms. So the influx of Jews is unprecedented in American history up to that point in time. And that creates a certain degree of consternation among various factions of Americans who are inflected with a kind of xenophobic anti-Semitism. Now, that's not true of all Gentile Americans. There were plenty of Americans, including those of devout Christian faith, who embraced these Jewish newcomers. And Roosevelt, by and large, when it came to the question of Jewish immigration, cast his lot with that latter group.
Mm. Let's turn to some of the positions that Roosevelt held. He starts in the state assembly, but then goes on to be appointed police commissioner at the age of 36 in 1895. What was his mandate? What was he trying to do as police commissioner?
At that time, New York City was governed by Tammany Hall, which was a democratic organization that had perfected the art of machine politics, whereby you might give favors and certain patronage positions to different ethnic enclaves within New York. But Tammany Hall was very corrupt, and they didn't actually meaningfully address the concerns and the dire conditions in which new immigrants, Jews and others alike, found themselves subsisting in. These were people living in crowded tenements, laboring in sweatshops, and enduring abject poverty. Roosevelt's mandate as the young new police commissioner was to clean up the city, to end the corruption that had become endemic in the police force, and then to use a police force that had a newfound premium on probity and professionalism to clean up New York City itself, to bring down the crime rates, and by Roosevelt's light, be a kind of moral standard that could usher in a new era for the people of New York. So that was his mandate, and his relationship with the Jewish community was very much a part of his broader agenda.
In fact, you write that he would walk the tenements of the Lower East Side with a message saying that my police force is a merit-based police force. And if you Jewish males want to join my police force, I'm all open arms for you, right? And this was an unusual thing, especially we talked about the Jew as his stereotype feckless coward. Here's Roosevelt saying, come on and join us. We can do this together.
Indeed, Roosevelt had a couple different motivations for recruiting Jews to the police force. Partly it was a matter of principle. He thought it important that the NYPD look like the city at large. And it was a question of practicality as well. He needed Yiddish speaking officers who could understand East Side residents literally and culturally. And I would add that it was a stirring sight for Jewish newcomers who had fled Old World oppression to find a Jew donning a policeman's uniform. Back in the Old World, police had enforced discriminatory laws against Jews, and police had stood idly by as mobs had mercilessly beat Jewish victims. But in America, in Theodore Roosevelt's police force, Jews themselves could become commanding figures, defenders of the people and of the people's law.
Tell us the story before we move on to the Rough Riders. And I have to say to our listening audience, we're going to touch on a couple of topics here, but the book is so much more expansive and so worth buying and reading. But you tell a story about a New York Hanukkah visit by a well-known anti-Semite. Tell us about that story and what Roosevelt did.
So in 1895, during Roosevelt's first year as police commissioner, a virulent German anti-Semite named Hermann Olvart had planned a trip to America to spread his hateful message. And Olvart had provocatively scheduled a lecture on the Lower East Side, the beating heart of American Jewish life. And when local Jews found out that Olvart was coming to speak in their own neighborhood, they approached Commissioner Roosevelt and they asked TR to bar Olvart from speaking, or at least to deny him police protection. But Roosevelt felt that he could not grant their request without undermining the principle of free speech. And even absent that constitutional right, Roosevelt thought that government censorship would only serve to turn Olvart into a martyr for his cause. And so Roosevelt decides he's going to do something very clever. He quietly resolves unto himself that he is going to assign Olvart a police detail consisting exclusively of Jewish officers. What Roosevelt understood was that the sight of Jewish policemen guarding this German hate monger would do far more to undermine Olvart's hateful message than government censorship ever could have.
And he wanted officers who looked as Jewish as a Jewish person can look, whatever that exactly means, right?
Exactly. Roosevelt tells a deputy of his to round up a few dozen Jewish policemen. And Roosevelt says to this deputy, and I'm quoting here, "Don't bother yourself to hunt up their religious antecedents. Take only those who have the most pronounced Hebrew physiognomy. The stronger their ancestral marking, the better." Roosevelt says he wanted these men to look unmistakably Jewish. And when this group of Jewish officers is gathered before Commissioner Roosevelt, one of Roosevelt's friends would later remark, and again, I'm quoting here, "A more Hebraic group of Hebrews was never before gathered in one small room." And Roosevelt tells this group of Jewish officers that he is going to assign them to the most important duty of their life, which was the protection of an enemy and thereby the defense of free speech in the chief city of the United States. It is a model for how to confront anti-Semitism by making anti-Semites look, in Roosevelt's words, ridiculous.
So Roosevelt campaigns for McKinley, who's running for president, and McKinley wins and is nicely paying Roosevelt back with a position as Secretary of the Navy, Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Roosevelt's task there is to build up the Navy. And Roosevelt sees that there's going to be war with Spain. There's going to be a Spanish-American war. And to his Maccabee, I wish I had a little Jew in me, really wants to participate. So tell us about his departure from his Assistant Secretary of the Navy position, his standing up the Rough Riders, and again, the importance of diversity in the Rough Riders to Roosevelt.
Roosevelt, in his position at the Navy, was never shy about conveying to McKinley that A, America should be involved in a war against Spain in Cuba, and B, that Roosevelt himself should personally have a command and be leading men in the field of battle. And ultimately, against McKinley's wishes, both of those things come to pass. McKinley ultimately has to acquiesce to the war fervor sweeping the country, and Roosevelt takes charge of the cavalry regiment that would become known as the Rough Riders. And his first order of business is to select from some 23,000 applicants the 1,000 men who would join him in battle against the Spanish. And he chooses everyone from Western cowboys to Princeton alums, from Cherokee citizens to polo players, and yes, Jews as well. And Roosevelt and these men land on Cuban shores in June of 1898, and these Jewish Rough Riders face down Spanish bullets alongside their colonel. And one of them, Roosevelt famously promotes on account of, quote, conspicuous gallantry in the field of battle. One of Roosevelt's favorite Jewish soldiers, he would later recall in his autobiography, the other soldiers ironically nicknamed Pork Chop. And Roosevelt took great pride in these Jewish soldiers. He wanted his regiment to reflect the diversity of America religiously, and he believed that these Maccabean warriors donning American uniforms, fighting against the Spanish Empire that had inflicted an inquisition on the Jewish people for hundreds of years, was a testament, it was a testament to the American principle of merit and of religious equality
and diversity. He was a big believer. I mean, perhaps that word is the umbrella over which everything you've just said is, but he recognized the importance, and he said it repeatedly in the book, of diversity, that the diversity of the government had to reflect the diversity of our great country.
Indeed, Roosevelt did genuinely believe in the merits of diversity. And I think that his recruitment of diverse people to the Rough Riders, where you have life and death circumstances, is a striking testament to that. At the time of the Spanish-American War, there was racial segregation in the troops. And so one group that was notably left out of the Rough Riders were Black Americans. And so there are limits to the diversity that we see in Roosevelt's day during that conflict with Spain.
Yeah. So fast forwarding a little bit, Roosevelt, on the heels of his success as a Rough Rider, runs and wins the governorship of New York, where he does some important things like the tenement house and makes multiple political appointments. But talk briefly during his governorship about the Dreyfus Affair and how that played out.
The Dreyfus Affair was a global scandal that is rooted in France. Alfred Dreyfus was a French military official who was accused on bogus grounds of having divulged military secrets to an adversarial power. And these accusations were without merit, but Dreyfus had the unfortunate reality of being a Frenchman in a country that was still afflicted with anti-Semitism, all of its supposed Enlightenment ideals that animated the French Revolution notwithstanding. And so it was clear to the Jewish community, indeed to the world, that the evidence against Alfred Dreyfus was insufficient to sustain any kind of conviction. And as Dreyfus was confined to a penal colony called Devil's Island off the coast of South America, many people around the world, including in the United States, lobbied for his release. And Roosevelt notably takes a stand on this issue. He is deeply supportive of the efforts to release Alfred Dreyfus, and he is in touch both with Jewish leaders and also with at least one Christian clergyman I found who was deeply philo-Semitic Christian clergyman, endorsing the efforts to try to secure Alfred Dreyfus's release. And people at that time noted the striking contrast between the way Alfred Dreyfus was being treated by the French military and the French state at large versus how Jews were treated in Roosevelt's Rough Riders, where they were embraced as equals. It was a rather vivid juxtaposition that suggested that the Enlightenment project of religious equality perhaps had more traction in the United States than it did in even the supposedly civilized nations of Western Europe.
So he is chosen by McKinley to be his vice president. McKinley is assassinated. And I read this book for my podcast with David Rubenstein, and we talked about McKinley. And essentially, McKinley died from medical malpractice. The wound itself wasn't fatal, but the doctor kept sticking his finger into it and got him a blood disease, and he died of it. So Roosevelt becomes president, and he's trying to find his footing. He's the youngest president in the history of the United States at that time. And as we talked about, the world is sort of twisting and turning, and lots of things are going on. And one of the things that Roosevelt has to address quickly is the state of anti-Semitism in Romania, of all places. So tell us about what was going on in Romania. It got its independence from the Treaty of Berlin, which the United States was not even a party to. And Roosevelt's got to deal with this problem brought to him by his advisors. Tell us about the Romanian note.
Indeed, the treaty that you mentioned that gave Romania its independence in the 1870s required that Romania guarantee religious liberty and equality to its subjects. And yet, despite that assurance on paper, in reality, Romania's Jews were among some of the most oppressed Jews anywhere in the world. There were fewer and fewer jobs that they were allowed to occupy. There were many regions of Romania where they were not allowed to live. They were subjected not just to the formal second-class citizenship imposed on them by the state, but also by violent pogroms that destroyed Jewish property and claimed Jewish lives. And amid this deepening disaster for Romanian Jews, some of Roosevelt's informal Jewish advisors, including one fellow named Oscar Strauss, who worked in the Roosevelt administration, and another named Jacob Schiff, who was really the de facto spokesperson for American Jewish life. He was a banker and philanthropist in New York. They prevailed upon Roosevelt to do something to try to cajole Romania into addressing and really redressing the grievances of the Jewish community there. And as a secondary path, perhaps cajoling the European signatories to the treaty that created Romania into throwing their weight around to ensure that Romania actually abided by the requirement of that treaty to treat its Jewish population on par with its Gentiles. And so Roosevelt authorizes the issuance of what becomes known as the Romanian note. And it is at first a clandestine note sent to an American ambassador in the region with instructions on approaching the Romanian regime and confronting it about its problem with anti-Semitism. But it's pretty clear that the letter was crafted with an eye towards eventual public release and intended to be a kind of moral statement about America's position concerning the plight of Romanian Jews. The challenge facing Roosevelt is that it was considered a violation of diplomatic protocol at that time to speak out about another country's internal affairs, even on humanitarian grounds. There was a strong diplomatic norm of non-interference, wherein one nation ought not even comment on the holy domestic matters of another. And so Roosevelt needed some kind of hook, some sort of international pretext to justify this kind of humanitarian remonstrance against Romania. And to do that, Roosevelt, at the suggestion of his advisors, ultimately seizes on immigration. And so the logic of the Romanian note is, well, Romania is deeply anti-Semitic towards its Jews, and that is forcing Jews to flee to America for refuge. And that migration of Romanian Jews to America makes it an international issue rather than an exclusively domestic one for Romania, and thereby justifies America's humanitarian defense of beleaguered Romanian Jewry. Now, this was purely pretextual. And in fact, as soon as the Romanian note becomes public, the press, including the Washington Post, among other papers, immediately infers correctly that the immigration issue is pure pretext. At that time, not even 7,000 Romanian Jews were coming to America annually. It wasn't actually a concern of Roosevelt's. And what I think is so striking about this episode is that there are so many times in American history where the United States has been accused of pursuing some sort of material agenda and then cloaking it in humanitarian garb as a way of trying to justify it. Here we have a striking illustration of just the reverse. America's real motive was to pursue a humanitarian agenda, and then the United States had to offer a pretext of self-interest as a way of Trojan horsing that humanitarianism into its foreign policy.
Right. And America, that is the we, were very susceptible, I guess, to the criticism of the way African Americans were being treated in the United States. How dare you talk about what's our internal problem with the Jews when you have lynchings going on, in the Confederacy, essentially. And he had to be mindful of the double standard, hence the pretext of it being an international rather than internal domestic issue. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Roosevelt is as well aware as anyone that anytime he hazards some sort of humanitarian reproach of an Eastern European country like Romania or Russia, he risks a countervailing criticism from those Eastern European powers about the raft of extra legal lynchings that are disproportionately targeting Blacks in the American South. And so Roosevelt is well aware of the potential hypocrisy that America is risking on the world stage. And it is yet one of many landmines that he has to try to navigate as he figures out how is America as an international player going to deal with the ever deepening humanitarian crisis for Jews in countries that are hostile to them.
Right. Which brings us to Kishinev. So on the heels of the Romanian note, there's this 1903 Kishinev massacre, which again falls right front and center on Roosevelt's desk. Tell us about Kishinev and Roosevelt's response to it.
Well, Kishinev is a city that at the time was in southwestern Russia. And on Easter Sunday, 1903, what begins with some youngsters picking on Jews soon escalates into adults ransacking Jewish businesses. A mob overcomes the Feldstein Saloon on Armenia Street, and one rioter who finds a slab of meat climbs atop the roof of the saloon and announces to a horde gathered in the street below, "Here are the remains of a Christian child found in the home of the wealthy Jew." What ensues over the next 48 hours was a pogrom of such unconscionable cruelty that when its details became known in the United States, they would shock the American conscience. And mass protests of Jews and Gentiles alike plead for their president to intercede. They imagine that if Roosevelt forcefully speaks out about the catastrophe visited upon Kishinev's Jews, that it would affirm America's high-minded ideals and shame Russia into reversing its repression. And Roosevelt has to decide whether he is going to capitulate to this public uproar and speak out on humanitarian grounds in defense of these embattled Jews overseas, or is he going to capitulate to the voices from the State Department who do not want Roosevelt to put himself out on behalf of global Jewry for fear of offending Russia and aggravating Russian-American relations? And so this becomes a major challenge early in Roosevelt's presidency on the global stage.
And in the end, he agrees to the submission to Russia of a petition, largely drafted by Strauss and Schiff and B'nai B'rith. What did it say, and what was the consequence of that petition?
Yeah, ultimately, Roosevelt boxes out the State Department. His Secretary of State actually admits in a letter to his wife that he's thinking about resigning over the path that Roosevelt's taking on Kishinev. That's how important these Jewish issues were to American foreign policy. And Roosevelt gathers some of these informal Jewish advisors you mentioned to his Sagamore Hill estate, and they decide to proceed, as you mentioned, to submit to the Tsar a petition organized by these American Jewish leaders and signed by their fellow citizens of all faiths that called on the Tsar to protect the lives and the liberty of his Jewish subjects. Now, ultimately, the Kishinev petition was, in one sense, a failure. It did not result in the amelioration of dire conditions for Jews in the Tsar's dominions. To the contrary, Kishinev marked the beginning of a 3-year wave of pogroms that spilled Jewish blood in a fashion and to a degree that was unprecedented in Russian history. But on the other hand, the Kishinev pogrom, the Kishinev petition, I should say, was celebrated by American Jews because here they had found in Theodore Roosevelt a head of state who was willing to do what no other world leader would, which was to challenge the Tsar on the world stage in a public fashion over the anti-Semitic violence that was being inflicted on the Tsar's Jewish subjects.
Right. And it addresses this question that you asked in the beginning about America and its ascendancy as a voice of moral clarity on the world stage. And what we see from Roosevelt, which was perhaps a positive result of this petition, is when the Sino-Russian War breaks out, the Japanese-Russian War breaks out, Roosevelt sides with Japan essentially and leads ultimately to the Portsmouth meetings that got Roosevelt his Nobel Peace Prize. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Both Russia and Japan had warring ambitions over their imperial strategy in the Far East. Uh, Russia had designs on Manchuria, and Japan had its stake in Korea, which was just south of Manchuria. And so it was perhaps only inevitable that Russia and Japan would find themselves in armed conflict. And there was a world where Roosevelt would be largely, removed as a player or not necessarily favoring Japan. But it is precisely because of Russia's treatment of the Russian Jewish community that Russia actually pushes Roosevelt to adopt a more pro-Japanese position. And Roosevelt is ultimately the person who gets Russia and Roosevelt to get Russia and Japan rather to come to the bargaining table, to go to Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and to hammer out a peace treaty. And as you note, Roosevelt wins the Nobel Peace Prize. He's the first American to win a Nobel in any category for his role in ensuring peace between Russia and Japan. And what's so striking about that is that these were bilateral negotiations. America wasn't even party to the negotiations. Roosevelt wasn't even in Portsmouth, but he was frenetically sending cables back and forth between the summer White House and Portsmouth, between his Sagamore Hill estate and Tokyo and St. Petersburg, then the Russian capital. And so Roosevelt, despite his absence, is so central to the peace effort that he nabs the Nobel Prize.
So we've been talking about international affairs, but you've got the 1906 midterm elections in the US, and Roosevelt is very concerned about the governorship in New York, and he has a plan to bolster the chances of Hughes, who's the Republican, against William Randolph Hearst. And so what does he do? What's his secret plan to bolster what would become future Chief Judge of the Supreme Court, Charles Evans Hughes? What did he do?
Well, I'll say by way of context that Roosevelt had remarkable attention to the Jewish vote. And that begins as police commissioner, where he goes block by block through the Lower East Side, espousing his egalitarian ethos, and his ascension to national politics in no way diminished Roosevelt's granular emphasis on the Jewish vote. In fact, he's so focused on the Jewish vote that when he catches wind that a local county slate of judges that's going to cover Manhattan includes only a secular Jew and not also an Orthodox Jew, Roosevelt personally intervenes to remedy that omission. And that's despite the extraordinary portfolio of challenges he has to manage as president. So it's really remarkable. And it makes it unsurprising that Roosevelt decides to do something historic, in part to help ensure a Republican victory in that 1906 New York governor's race. Roosevelt becomes the first president to appoint a Jew to a cabinet level position. And the Jew that he selects for this honor is someone I mentioned earlier in our conversation, Oscar Straus. And it's really a remarkable moment for Straus. Back in the 1860s, he had been denied membership in a campus literary society at Columbia because of his Jewish identity. Now he's being conferred membership in the cabinet of an American president. I know it might be hard for modern listeners today to imagine a world where Columbia is in the news for having issues with anti-Semitism, but try as you might. And strikingly, it's not just any cabinet position, but he's put in charge of the Department of Commerce and Labor, which has as its purview immigration policy. So think about this for a moment. Roosevelt, at the peak of anti-Semitic xenophobia in America, or at least one of the peaks, Roosevelt puts not just a Jew, but actually a foreign-born Jew in charge of administering America's immigration policy. It is truly an audacious move from Roosevelt in an era when anti-Semitism still had considerable traction with many Protestant leaders in that time.
Yeah. And what I think is clear, though there's conflicts in Roosevelt's immigration policies, he supported a literacy test for new immigrants, which thankfully didn't materialize. And he talked a little bit about quotas, but basically at his heart, at his core, was his desire to have America serve as a refuge for the world's oppressed. Is that right?
For sure. Roosevelt did believe in America as an asylum for the downtrodden from other countries. And he is particularly amenable to the aspirations of immigrants at a time when many others are not. He does run into some challenges on questions of Jewish immigration in his second term. You mentioned the literacy test, which, if it had passed Congress, would have made literacy in any language a prerequisite for admission into the country. And the test was neutral on its face, but in practice, it would disproportionately exclude Eastern European Jews and Southern Italians, whose literacy rates were much lower than immigrants from the likes of England or Denmark. And so Roosevelt finds himself on the same side as the literacy test as prominent xenophobes who want to curb Jewish immigration for fear that it will corrupt America's racial purity. But Roosevelt's motives are not sinister. He thinks that a literacy test will, he recognizes it will curb immigration, but his ambition is to help give some reprieve to newly settled immigrants whom he feared would not be able to ascend out of poverty if their living conditions and wages were perpetually suppressed by an unrestricted deluge of foreign labor. And Roosevelt thought that the literacy test could be a means to check certain industries that were exploiting mass migration. But these benevolent intentions aside, Roosevelt's position on the bill alienated him from longtime Jewish allies who rightly fretted that the literacy test, had it been adopted, would pose an existential threat to countless Jews overseas seeking to escape habitual bouts of butchery. Ultimately, Roosevelt abandons his support for the literacy test and he pivots back to what was generally his default position on Jewish immigration, which was to welcome it with open arms. So Roosevelt does have this moment of real strain around the literacy test, but that's against a backdrop of a broader lockstep with the Jewish community in terms of welcoming Jewish newcomers who are seeking freedom and opportunity in the new world.
And in fact, you can see over the course of Roosevelt's political career, where he has to be elected, how important his relationship with American Jewry was to his electoral and the electoral ambitions of the Republican Party. Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, Roosevelt, as I mentioned before, is remarkably attuned to the Jewish vote. New York City is fast becoming 28% Jewish over the course of Roosevelt's lifetime. With each new election season, there are more and more Jewish voters. And Roosevelt, as mentioned, was willing to make this significant appointment to the cabinet, not just because he believed in Oscar Strauss's ability, but he timed it deliberately on the eve of the 1906 election to maximize its electoral impact. And Roosevelt is so concerned about the Jewish vote that he is even willing to make his foreign policy the handmaiden of his domestic electioneering. In 1904, Roosevelt had taken a secret, clandestine diplomatic effort on behalf of Russian Jews, and it had been kept under wraps. But Roosevelt empowers the chairman of the Republican National Convention to declassify State Department records right before the election so that the public, and specifically Jewish voters, can learn about his heretofore hidden efforts on their behalf. And Roosevelt, similarly, 4 years later, in 1908, he's concerned about whether his handpicked successor for the presidency, William Howard Taft, is going to be able to recreate his success with Jewish voters. And Roosevelt relentlessly pressures his Secretary of State to refuse to extradite a Russian refugee back to the Tsar's empire, despite the fact that an American immigration commissioner had found that this person had committed crimes that were subject to prosecution in Russia. And Roosevelt does that specifically to appease the Jewish community. So it would be wrong to say that Roosevelt's humanitarian foreign policy for Jews was born exclusively out of electoral concerns, but it would also be naive to ignore the fact that many of Roosevelt's boldest actions in his Jewish diplomacy happened to coincide with his election year ambitions to shore up that crucial constituency.
I have one question which I want to ask based on something in the chat, and then I'm going to turn it over to Robin. And that is, what is noteworthy about Teddy Roosevelt is that he bypassed his State Department on many matters involving Jewish global and domestic interests. He had his own inner circle of Jews who advised him and whose counsel he took. And I want you to talk a little bit about that and compare and contrast it with FDR, his cousin's reliance on the State Department, a very anti-Semitic State Department. So can you do a little compare and contrast? And then, Robin, it's all yours.
Yeah, to be sure, at the time of Theodore Roosevelt's administration, and this continues to be true during the era of FDR, many of the people at the State Department come from a certain swath of American society, the elite, white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, blue bloods, some of whom had sympathy for Jews, many of whom did not. There was a kind of genteel anti-Semitism that afflicted the particular class of people who were predominating in the State Department. And Roosevelt, as I mentioned earlier, boxes out the State Department. He's crafting his Jewish diplomacy with a freewheeling conversation with informal Jewish advisors, and sometimes whoever happened to be visiting him on hand that day at Sagamore Hill. When he is formulating his policy around the Kishinev petition, he does it with his Jewish kitchen cabinet, as I call it in the book, and a British judge, a magazine editor, and his 19-year-old daughter, Alice. Not a single member of his State Department was present. The State Department found itself reduced to executing orders rather than driving policy. FDR, of course, served as president during the crisis of the Holocaust, which eclipsed in unconscionable orders of magnitude the pogroms of Roosevelt's day. And yet, the later Roosevelt, FDR, is operating far more in the confines of his State Department and is not willing to buck the State Department in the way that his fifth cousin was willing to a couple generations earlier. And I'm not I don't profess to be an FDR expert, and so I want to be cautious about saying too much. But there's a really excellent body of academic literature written on FDR's strained relationship with the Jewish community and documenting many of his failures to advance the cause of embattled Jews overseas as vigorously as Theodore Roosevelt had. And so I won't profess to be the FDR expert, but I think that from what I know, looking at FDR and TR, I think that Theodore Roosevelt stacks up pretty well relative to his cousin.
Yeah. Oscar Strauss, his cabinet secretary, has way more influence on his views than Morgenthau has on FDR's. Robin,
Absolutely.
it's all yours.
Well, thank you. And bravo to both of you. What a wonderful and informative conversation. Big thanks to both of you. And let's look in the chat. So Jeff Spector asks, is there data on how Jews voted in presidential or other elections at the time? Did they support Roosevelt for president, for governor?
Jeff, I'm so glad you asked this because together with a small team of research assistants, I am the first person to actually go block by block through the Lower East Side, that iconic Jewish neighborhood, and actually tally the votes across multiple presidential elections. There are historians who have thrown out really speculation about how Roosevelt performed with Jewish voters. But in my book, for the first time, we actually have the hard data. And what I found was that when Roosevelt was at the top of the ticket, he remade the electoral map for Republicans. It's unsurprising that Roosevelt fared well with the affluent, assimilated Central European Jews who tended to vote Republican anyway. What makes Roosevelt so remarkable was his astonishing success with the Lower East Side, what were called the downtown Jews, the Lower East Side Eastern European Jews who were hawking goods from push carts and slaving over sewing machines in sweatshops. This tended to be traditionally Democratic turf. And yet Roosevelt, in a manner that was totally anomalous for Republican presidential nominees at the time, actually wins the Lower East Side. He outperforms every Republican down ballot from him. And yet, even as he outperforms his fellow Republicans, his coattails are so significant that he completely remakes the electoral math. So, for instance, there was a particular state legislative assembly district on the Lower East Side that had gone Democratic in 30 consecutive elections. But with Roosevelt at the top of the ticket, the Republicans actually flipped that seat. One other metric I'll mention, the Democratic Jewish congressman who represented the Lower East Side in the House of Representatives in DC, he typically won election by 30 points, 30 points. But when Roosevelt was up the top of the ticket, that 30-point average margin of victory plummeted to just 2%. It is a striking indication of the remarkable relationship that Roosevelt had cultivated with Jewish constituencies that had been conventionally beyond the grasp of Republican politicians. So thank you very much for that question, Jeff.
So it's coming on 12. So let me just pick one more question, which is a very nice one to end on. This is from Barbara Geffen, who asks you, Andrew, to tell the story about the person who guarded Roosevelt's body after he died, but before he was buried.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. Roosevelt passed away a decade after he steps down from the White House. And the night before his funeral, Roosevelt's body was resting in his trophy room of his Sagamore Hill estate. And the trophy room was appropriately named. Its many trophies, gifts, and mementos reflected Roosevelt's various sides. There was the Rough Rider saber embodying Roosevelt, the soldier. There was a samurai sword, a gift from the Japanese emperor signifying Roosevelt the diplomat. There was a golden eagle mounted between the windows embodying Roosevelt the patriot. Now, there is a tradition common to Judaism and Christianity alike that calls on the living to keep watch over the dead before burial. And on that last night in Sagamore Hill, there was only one person who was permitted to keep watch over Roosevelt's body. And that honor didn't fall to any of the famous personages who had populated his life, nor to his eldest child, nor to the best man at his wedding. In those small hours, as the world slept, Roosevelt's only companion was a Jewish immigrant. His name was Otto Raphael. And decades earlier, after Raphael had braved a burning building and saved people from a fire in the tenements of the Lower East Side, Theodore Roosevelt had recruited Raphael to his police force back in 1895. And the two of them were both boxers. They became sparring partners in the ring. And in that boxing ring, they forged a lifelong friendship. Now, the differences between them were rather striking, as you might imagine. The one, a strictly kosher Russian Jew raised in East Side slums. The other was a silver spoon cowboy with Dutch blood and a Harvard diploma. But they had a lifelong friendship, and Roosevelt treated Raphael as an equal. And as I mentioned in the book, it could not have been lost on Otto Raphael that back in the Tsar's dominions that he had fled, Raphael might have been savagely slaughtered. But in the United States, Otto Raphael could keep company with an American president. And in that trophy room, adorned with these tokens of feats and fame from throughout Roosevelt's life, I think there is no finer tribute to Roosevelt than that last farewell between these two friends the evening before Roosevelt's funeral. So thank you so much for that question.
Robin, before we end, I want to ask one more question, if I can, that follows on that, which is something that you wrote, which I thought was so clear about who Teddy Roosevelt was in relationship to the Jews. And you write that the best indicator of his goodwill toward Jews wasn't his vocal defense of Jews in public, where he stood to score points with Jewish constituencies. It was rather his willingness in private moments to risk alienating friends over their intolerance of Jews when he had nothing to gain. So talk about that.
Indeed, Roosevelt had a number of friends who reflected the common biases of his class, and that they did not much care for Jews. They didn't want the affluent Jews showing up at their summer resorts. They didn't want those Jews' children attending their kids' prep schools. And they certainly didn't care for the mass of indigent Jewish refugees who were pouring into American ports. And Roosevelt would operate in the same circles as these people. He befriended them. Their anti-Semitism was not an obstacle to cultivating warm relations with Roosevelt. And yet he repeatedly calls them out in private correspondence for their anti-Semitism. And he tries to push them to adopt his own warmer embrace of the Jewish people. And as you note, Michael, it is so striking to me because one could perhaps, if they were cynical, shrug off all of Roosevelt's gesture for Jews as nothing more than politicking, nothing more than political self-interest. He was, after all, a political animal. And yet, here we find in the confines of these private letters that I uncovered in the archives, letters that have been untouched by other Roosevelt biographers, we see him chastising friends for their Judeophobia. I think it is the most revealing evidence that we have that Roosevelt's affinity for the Jewish people was genuine and it ran deep.
Wonderful. Maybe I'm going to pull one more question from the chat because of what you just said, which is Barry Bowden asks, why, with all of this, why do you think Roosevelt is not better known as a friend to the Jews?
You know, it's a really good question. I think that religion is often given short shrift in American history generally. A lot of historians are, they're professors at universities, and they often lean more secular. And so I think that they're not looking to religion as often as we should be as a historical profession in trying to understand American politics. And on the Jewish side of the equation, with Jewish studies, a lot of the center of gravity of Jewish studies is European Jewish history and also Israel. And those are, of course, incredibly important topics. And I'm glad that they're really robust areas. But American Jewish history is sort of is it hasn't received the same degree of attention and focus as those other two areas. And so I think that in a sense, when you combine a kind of blind spot about religion when it comes to presidential history, and you add that to a focus in Jewish studies that is often focused on areas of the world beyond American shores, I think that has added up to this missing link. And I'm really grateful to get to be the first person to share this story. And it is a testament to the fact that, as I told Michael at the beginning of the conversation, I told my publisher this is actually going to be a really short book, that even I didn't appreciate the depth and the complexity and the richness of this story. And so I think it's unsurprising that it's gone overlooked and neglected by other historians.
Well, we're very grateful that you took it on. And I understand you may be writing a part two, that another book about Teddy Roosevelt.
I
And
am.
yeah.
I am. There was so much material that I'm actually breaking this into two books, and so I am working on a book about the sequel. And maybe if I'm lucky, I'll have an opportunity to join you folks again on Zoom or maybe in person and get to talk about the sequel. Roosevelt's relationship with the Jewish community in his post presidency is itself so rich and encompasses issues that are so distinct from those that preoccupy his presidential years or his earlier years that it really deserved its own volume. We see Roosevelt deeply involved with a generation of young Jewish female writers. We see Roosevelt involved with Jewish suffragettes. We see Roosevelt taking a rather bold stand in the public arena on the issue of Zionism at a time when World War I and the Balfour Declaration throws the question of Zionism into high relief. And so there are so many angles to Roosevelt's Jewish story in his post-presidential years that they could only be properly dealt with in a separate book. And so I'm working on it now, and I'm hoping in a couple of years to have that available for the reading public.
And in fact, Andrew, one of the things I will say is that in our last conversation with this collection of folks, we talked about a book called The Melting Point, which talks about Roosevelt in little teeny bit of his immigration versus assimilation, maintain your identity versus assimilation. So add that to your book. And then I can say on behalf of the 207 people who are on this call, we would love to do this in person in Tempe, Arizona next winter.
It's 69 degrees here today, and you're all very welcome.
Thank you very much.
That's wonderful. Well, we'll keep that warm invitation in mind, and so much more that we could discuss, so many questions in the chat, but it is time to end the program. So thank you so much, Andrew and Michael. It was really a privilege to listen to your conversation.